Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us for this discussion. It's entitled Restoring Southeast Asia's Democratic Health After COVID-19. Today's webinar is part of a series of dialogues that the Kofi Annan Foundation has been organizing as an attempt to shape the global debate around the effects of the pandemic on our democratic structures and electoral processes. Within Southeast Asia, there is such a tremendous diversity of societies, political systems, cultures, and economies that it would be wrong to talk about the impact and response of, quote unquote, the region as if it is some kind of monolith. Governments here and elsewhere are navigating between keeping economies functioning at one end of the spectrum and limiting the spread of the infection, saving lives, and not overburdening the health systems at the same time at the other. We have a slide, I believe, that we can show you because as of July the 12th, Southeast Asia, that is to say the 10 ASEAN member countries plus Timor-Leste, have reported 5,122 COVID-19 deaths in this region. That slide breaks it down to individual countries with figures from data as received by the World Health Organization from national authorities by July the 12th. All in all, 5,122 people have died in this region. Now, I've spent most of the lockdown in the United Kingdom, though I'm now in Manila. And for context, I wanted to share with you that the WHO says there have been 44,798 deaths in the United Kingdom alone. So, for the next 90 minutes, we will hear from 4 outstanding leaders and commentators with unique experiences and insights as they reflect on the effect of the pandemic on the region's aspirations for democracy and growth, and for what can be done to address this going forward. His Excellency José Ramos Horta has lived an extraordinary life as a rebel activist, Nobel Peace Laureate, and President of Timor-Leste. Such a pleasure to have him here. Dr. Noeleen Heyzer is Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, formerly, that is, and former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. She's particularly concerned with the social and economic impact of the pandemic on migrants and the most marginalized in the region. Dr. Thant Myint-U is a historian who's taught at Cambridge University for many years, author of 4 books on Burmese and Asian history, and most recently, The Hidden History of Burma, Race, Capitalism, and the Crisis of Democracy in the 21st Century. He's been involved in reform efforts in Myanmar since the late 2000s, including as a presidential advisor. And of course, I first came across him during the time he served with the UN for over 12 years on peacekeeping missions and as the head of policy planning in the Department of Political Affairs under Kofi Annan. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the participation of you, the audience, as well a little later with poll type questions, which are some kind of the norm in the new age of the webinar, and in a question and answer section as well, which we'll have during the last half hour of the session. We also have a surprise guest. So do we want to just quickly show our surprise guest, if possible? Maria Ressa is not that far away in Manila, and I hope that she can share with us her experiences under COVID-19 and with her case, which has become something, of course, celeb, of course, around the world, about freedom of expression. And she really knows an extraordinary amount about, what's going on in the world when it comes to digital democracy, which I know is one of the favorite topics of the Kofi Annan Foundation. They've got a really great program about that. But we'll go to Maria a little bit later. First of all, I wanted to ask His Excellency José Ramos Horta in Chile. just a sort of survey about all of you, of what's the situation where you are. José Ramos Horta, what have been the social, economic, and political impacts of the pandemic in your country? What have been the early indications of the impact on your country's democratic aspirations?
Thank you. Great privilege to join all of you and Kofi Annan Foundation initiative to have this conversation. Speaking from Dili, Timor-Leste, and in the midst of so much pessimism around the world, in the region, I would like to share with you some good news. In the beginning of the pandemic in the region, we had 24 imported cases. These were 2 or 3 Europeans, several 20 some Timorese who came from Indonesia. They're all mild cases, and now since April, we don't have a case. All of these positive cases, they were released from hospital. Multiple tests were done to confirm that they were negative, so they were released home. We continue to be very vigilant. Our borders remain closed. We don't have any cluster, any community transmission. As we dealt with the public health issue brought about by COVID, we also developed a social strategy to assist families throughout the country. Every single family in the country, for 3 months, they receive financial money, they receive cash from the government. In addition, convoys of food were delivered to different areas that are even more needed. And we did something unique. I don't think any other country has done that. We have send money abroad to our students and some other needy Timorese who are in Indonesia, in UK, in United States. Because during the normal times, they were contributing, sending money home to their families, working in UK, in Portugal, in Australia, in South Korea, and some, of course, studying in Indonesia. So the government has done the reverse by sending some money to the ones that are most needed. So right now we have 0 infection and we had 0 death. Of course, the COVID has had its international economic impact. Hundreds of millions of people around the world were thrown back into unemployment and poverty. We are a small oil-producing country. We had a good sovereign fund, which had accumulated in only a few years $17 billion, which we invested in U.S. Treasury bonds. We invested in equities around the world. As a result of the global recession and the COVID, we lost overnight more than $1.6 billion, $1.6 billion. We are helping companies to survive. We are helping some hotels to survive. Of course, not always very efficient, the execution of this government plan, because some people still remain to be paid, some debts still remain to be covered. But in regards to politics, the country is absolutely stable, peaceful. I always, now there is a debate about defamation law. And I tell the people, this is not a priority for us. Priority for us should be focused on food security, helping our families, poorest people to feed themselves, helping students to go back to school, etc. These are the priorities. They're not a defamation law. On the other hand, I added, look, even if we fail in everything, if we fail in delivering to the people, but one of the greatest gifts of our struggle for independence is freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to criticize anyone through the mainstream media, television, through social media. if we intimidate people through a defamation law, well, we are losing also this greatest gift of independence. We may lose everything, but we should not lose the greatest gift of independence. So I'm totally against any defamation law that criminalizes defamation. And that's, but I would say we have zero political prisoner. There's not a single newspaper, a single journalist that has been interrogated, questioned, least of all in prison. Our people are very vocal, very independent-minded, and leaders are persuaded that freedom of expression, criticism are the right of every citizen. So in this regard, COVID and this global recession is impacting us, is not impacting on our democratic values and practices. We are doing very well in this regard. Our democracy is imperfect, not less perfect than the United States or Australia, imperfect as most democracies, but we are not harassing any journalist, any politician, any civil society member for criticizing government either in public gatherings or through mainstream media or through social networks.
Thank you so much, President Ramos Horta. We will hear much more from you as we go on. But for now, I'd like to hear from Dr. Noeleen Heyzer, because what have been your observations as the situation has unfolded? I mean, Singapore is so different, isn't it?
Thank you so much, Veronica, and it's such a pleasure to be with all my friends on this panel. Let me start by saying that Singapore is known for its world-class health systems, its public housings and infrastructure, as well as effective governance. And the government and our public institutions have actually learned from the way they responded to SARS in 2003. And was able and in fact praised internationally for bringing COVID-19 fully under control. However, on March 15, we had only 226 confirmed cases, but today we have 46,283. So what happened? I think Singapore has paid a heavy price in the crisis, because its initial thinking on public health and COVID-19 management did not seriously integrate the low-wage migrant population from the very start. And the infected were mainly from the 300,000 construction workers who were housed in tightly packed dormitories. But the Singapore government has taken very serious action to transfer workers to safer alternative living areas, to deploy support teams, set up medical facilities for massive screening and testing, and to bring in supplies and food, as well as to manage lockdowns. And I must say that the Prime Minister has shown quality leadership by taking personal responsibility for the welfare of the foreign workers, providing them with medical care and treatment, and ensuring that employers actually pay workers their salaries throughout this whole process so that they are able to remit their money home. So from the migrant workers population, let me now turn to the local community. I think the government has also worked successfully to prevent local community transmission. It has been very effective in terms of its cluster and contact tracing systems. And our doctors, nurses, and frontline workers have labored around the clock. And you saw that from that figure that you put up, that the death rate in Singapore is actually very low at 26 deaths. The leaders have also used the whole of society approach and communicated constantly with the public. There is a great awareness that of the economic and social impact on the countries. And to prevent a crisis within a crisis, there's been 4 very generous budgets of almost $100 billion that were rolled out to families, low-income households, small businesses, self-employed employers, and in order to support vulnerable workers, and also to ensure that the economic and social conditions can bounce back well after this unprecedented crisis. So the country has also focused on jobs for the future economy and have been focusing on the upgrading of Singaporeans through their future skill program or Skills Future program. But I know that everybody is very interested in what happened in the general elections in Singapore that was held a few days ago in the midst of the pandemic. And I think we were the first country in ASEAN to have that general election. Now, the governing party, the PAP, had 61.2% of the valid vote cast, with 83 out of the 93 seats in Parliament. The main opposition parties made a lot of headway in terms of the increase of percentage of votes. And the Workers' Party have won 10 seats, making it the leading opposition party. So what does all this mean for the democratic health of Singapore? I think there's a new sense of hope. People want to give the government a strong mandate, which they did, but they also wanted a stronger opposition in Parliament. And the fielding of highly qualified and eloquent candidates by the opposition means that policy ideas will be discussed more seriously. There will be more diverse voices and interests will be represented. The government will be pressured to have some difficult dialogues on issues of equality and also in terms of elite wages and low-wage workers, on race and discrimination. I also wanted to stress that actually all this has been brought about because there's also a demographic profile change of voters. In fact, there's much more younger, more educated voters who wanted to see a more inclusive society and more space and voice for genuine dialogue. And therefore, they are quite happy to see at least the start of the emergence of a two-party system for Singapore. So what is the impact of all this on Singapore's democratic aspiration? I think we have witnessed a strengthening of this aspiration at this defining moment. With 96% turnout of voters, people feel that they not only have a voice, but they actually see that the strength of democracy is its capacity for self-correction. So what is it that they want in terms of correction? I think people want a more empowered citizenry and independent civil society, including of women and young people. And I just want to stress that the winning opposition actually had a very good team of a multiracial team as well as a gender balanced team that won the Sengkang constituency. And this is they feel that this is important to help citizens stay informed and engaged, and also to boost the social morale and a sense of common purpose. I think the other thing that people want is to allow more fact-based debates about policy options and a freer media, and to build social trust through public accountability and transparency. I think people believe that it's only in healthy democracies that societies can build the needed social trust that will enable them to persevere in crisis, to maintain resilience in the face of hardship, to heal the societal divides through inclusive participation and dialogue, and to retain that confidence that the sacrifice will be shared throughout this difficult period of the crisis, as well as of the recovery process. Very often they feel that the power and privilege is so concentrated. What they want is dignity and rights for all citizens everywhere in the country.
It sounds like it is really quite an amazing moment. That nowadays people are saying it's a hinge moment in the world. And it's fascinating to hear, how that's kind of expressed itself in Singapore. More later from you, of course, Noeleen. You're not going to get away so easily. I'm going to ask you more questions later. But for now, let's go to Yangon. Thant Myint-U, what would you want to highlight about what's happened so far? I'm going to ask you specifically about the upcoming elections a bit later, but for now, just let us know about, what it's like in Myanmar under the coronavirus.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation. Let me just first say thank you very much to you and the organizers. It's a pleasure and an honor to join everyone here today. I think in Myanmar, if we just go back 3 months to early April, some of us were worried that we were facing a health apocalypse, given our proximity to China. It was at a time when the virus was exploding in China. We saw on our TV screens what was happening in Milan and New York and other places. And we remembered that this was a country in which there was almost no public healthcare system for the vast majority of people, that this was a country where tens of thousands of people were already dying from treatable diseases, where the healthcare system was rated one of the worst in the world, if not the very worst in the world back in the 2000s, where there's been significant new investment and progress, but where if we had an outbreak on the scale that we've seen in some countries in the world, we would really have faced a catastrophic health situation. But for reasons that I think are still very unclear to many people, and maybe in a year or two when we understand this virus better, we'll know which of these different theories are true and which are not, we've seen very little health impact of this virus so far. So the testing has been quite low. Only a few hundred people have been confirmed to be infected. The real number could be more than that, but no doctors that I know or epidemiologists believe that there's a hidden outbreak anywhere. So in general, the infection rates have been very low, and only 6 people have died so far. And most of the people who've been infected have been people who've come back from abroad. The government has done a good job. It was off to a slow start, but that's the same with governments almost everywhere in the world. But it moved quickly by April into a sort of a soft lockdown mode. It closed international borders. It quarantined migrant workers who were coming back from abroad. It helped students and others come back from abroad. And for those cases where people were infected, it tried very hard to track all contacts as well. So I think the government gets quite good marks for handling what has been so far not a big health crisis, and trying to steer a kind of middle ground between prioritizing this health crisis and not imposing the kind of strict lockdown that could have been very tough for workers and for others. But I think even though the health situation hasn't been bad, the economic consequences of this pandemic have been extremely severe in Myanmar because of the disruption in global supply chains, because of the closing of the China border through which a huge amount of Myanmar's trade passes, because of the situation of migrant workers, millions of whom live and work in Thailand alone. And so for those migrant workers, even the ones who haven't had to come back and who are still in Thailand, many of them see a cutting of their income or perhaps no income now for several months. And their families at home who are dependent, millions of poor families who are dependent on remittance incomes now are not receiving those incomes. Hundreds of thousands of otherwise impoverished young women who work in the garment sector have seen their jobs either lost or imperiled because of companies, mainly Western companies, cutting off orders of Myanmar-made garments to Europe and elsewhere. And farmers are losing income because of what I mentioned of the trade with China being disrupted. And so there, what we're reminded of are two things. The first is that Myanmar has no welfare system. It has no social security net. There is nowhere for poor people to turn to in this kind of crisis. And secondly, what we're reminded of is that Myanmar is still, after decades of dictatorship and 10 years of democratic transition, still a country which is overwhelmingly dependent on the export of primary commodities and cheap labor to neighboring countries. And so we're at a very interesting time in Myanmar. I'll just end by saying that, the government has committed 5% of GDP, so about $3 billion, to a COVID response. Whether that's used strategically, whether it's used to invest in the future, whether it's used to push the reset button and think about development options differently is a big question. And at a time where everywhere in the world, I think we need a more activist state, a state that can provide welfare services and also direct development in this world of climate change and fast science and technology change as well, is going to be a huge question here, especially because this is at a time when people are not thinking about a more activist state, but are still trying to come out from underneath what has been an incredibly repressive, corrupt state over the past many generations here.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a really helpful survey. It's been so interesting to hear the different perspectives and the diversity across the region from our three speakers. Now, as I mentioned, we have a surprise guest, as it were. Maria Ressa will be joining us in a minute. Maria, before we turn to you, I just want to mention that the Kofi Annan Foundation, along with 28 leaders, has published an open letter calling on governments and civil society to act to ensure that democracy does not become a kind of silent victim to the coronavirus pandemic. The good people on the Kofi Annan Foundation team have put together a slide that shows some of the measures taken by states to deal with the emergency that have concerned the foundation. If you would be so kind as to show that, perhaps people can, I think the one after that, please. This is, that's exactly right. These are observations made by the Kofi Annan Foundation. Worries about excessive force and violence, restrict movement, implementation of new digital surveillance systems, and use of censorship, which takes us to the case of the Philippines. As I say, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Maria Ressa, my friend and colleague, who was recently convicted here in the Philippines in a case that has caused concern about freedom of expression and the media. And I actually would like to put that into a larger context because it matters to people. Democracy matters to people around the world, even under COVID-19. So I just wanted to show people also another slide, if I may, Maria. Sorry to keep you waiting just a tiny bit longer. It's the one that I mentioned before, which was as a result of this Dahlia, which is a Berlin think tank survey, more than 100,000 people around the world in 53 countries. And they did go to the Philippines and they asked the question, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? My government has done too much to limit freedoms during the coronavirus crisis. In the Philippines, 56% of people agreed with that, 23% disagreed. I think we have the net there, and your net there is 33%, which the policy wonks among us are going to be very interested to see. So, Maria, would you like to link experience with concerns about democracy and possibly COVID-19? I mean, we were talking before about how COVID has starkly exaggerated issues and cases that play before the outbreak. And I know that you're in a hurry. I know that you have another appointment, and this was a kind of last minute, very, very kind participation by you. So thanks very much for this.
First, thank you for having us. So for the straight well, it's from Horta. They really pay.
Maria, I'm not hearing you that well. I don't think the signal's working that well suddenly. I hope that that's going to improve. Let's try again. Can we try again? Start from the beginning.
Hear me now? Let me see if A4. Is it better now? So
that seems slightly better. If I could ask you just to speak quite slowly and simply,
okay.
Would that be okay?
Yes, yeah. So I have it. I quick, right? I think one
beginning to hear questions, and I'm really pleased that that people are sending them in. Do please keep going with sending the questions. What we'd like to do is, while we're reconnecting with Maria, I'd like to turn to José Ramos Horta and ask him a bit more about his perceptions of the situation. Can you hear me, José?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
So my question, to keep it to 5 minutes, 7 minutes, is what is your assessment of the consequences of the pandemic for the region as a whole, particularly in view of your lifelong dedication to peace and democracy? And to me, it's important to mention peace at this point.
I think it would be, my view, an exaggeration to say that COVID suddenly provokes setbacks to democracy in Southeast Asia. Whatever was there for years. There has been evolution, progress in many ASEAN countries. Some others stood still in democracy development, and so on. In relation to COVID, I think Southeast Asia has escaped more or less reasonably, because Indonesia, 270 million people, and we are not hearing about hundreds of thousands of infected, hundreds of thousands of dead. But what COVID has exposed is the enormous inequalities even among ASEAN countries, among ASEAN countries, within each Southeast Asian country, the social inequality. And I think COVID and this recession may be waking up ASEAN leaders, ASEAN countries, to really push forward to a more integrated community of peoples, whereby there is more solidarity among ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, where there is much more philanthropy, there is much more investment in agriculture, food security, poverty eradication, and close a bit the gap between those who have everything and those who have nothing. I think this will, the good positive. I think I would be surprised if leaders in Southeast Asia, they are not thinking about that. Because at the same time also they are waking up to the fact that they have to accelerate the modernization of the economies of Southeast Asia to make Southeast Asian countries more independent of the major powers, because the supply chain, completely disrupted. It's a ridiculous situation whereby United States declare, for instance, China as an enemy, and yet United States almost completely dependent on China for ventilators, for masks, and for everything else. And so there is going to be this reorientation, reprioritizing investments by everyone. So there will be economic realignment in Southeast Asia and in Asia in relation to the rest of the world. And that's positive. I think it might wake up Southeast Asian and Asian leaders to transform Asian economies, but economies that have to be people-centered. It cannot continue with the few have everything, with ostentation. More disparity in Asia than you see in the United States, that you see in Europe, you see in Australia. And that is simply unacceptable and dangerous, because the poor people who cannot be faulted for economic crisis, they are not the ones who bankrupted banks, they are not the ones bankrupting factories, and yet hundreds of millions are thrown into poverty. I would say be careful with that. The demonstrations in the United States, the yellow jacket demonstrations in France and elsewhere has to do with alienation, with economic social disparities, with arrogance of the few, of the rich, towards those who have less. And so, if anything, I hope everyone will wake up to a new order that will be much more community-centered, much more people-centered.
Jose Ramos, also, can I just ask you to unpack something that you mentioned a bit earlier as well? Because you were talking about how democracy is not necessarily a priority. And yet you talk about importance of equality, social equality. Clearly, democracy works better if people feel equal. But, you know, for so long you were fighting for a voice for Timorese people. I think some people might be surprised that you're saying democratic issues are not a priority.
Another a priority. I'm saying we have to take to look at economic social disparities in Southeast Asia. In Asia, it's shocking, the disparities. A bit like in Brazil and many Latin American countries in the Middle East, the economic social disparities. Who are the people who suffer most with COVID? Well, the poorest in India, the poorest in Mexico, in Colombia, in Indonesia and elsewhere, not the rich. Although COVID doesn't discriminate, but the poorest are the ones who are losing jobs by the hundreds of millions, cannot feed their people. But what I said is that democracy is not only now with COVID that suddenly you found democracy is backtracking, losing in Southeast Asia. Well, you know, let me say, you know, Freedom House in Washington rates Timor-Leste as the most functioning democracy in Southeast Asia. Reporters Without Borders and also economists and others, they say Timor-Leste has the freest media in Southeast Asia. Some cynics responded to me and saying, well, with those kind of neighbors you have, it's not difficult to be the best in Southeast Asia. I'm not going to comment on that. It will be up to my brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia to comment on that. And the fact is, Timor-Leste is doing, I have to say, I'm not in government, so I'm not, you know, I say, in recognition of all our political leaders, in spite of their differences, our differences, one thing that has been untouched has been our democratic values, our democratic institutions. Of course, I hope also that in the post-COVID era, but in the course of it, reflection is done, self-examination is done by the leaders of the region, that maybe those who have not caught up with democracy, please introduce democratic reforms, open up, embrace those you claim to represent. These are your people. These are your people. They have to have a voice in the future of the country. They are the ones who toil every day in the countryside. They are the ones who work in the factories. They are the ones who produce their children for the future of the country. They have to be treated as equals with those who are in power. So listen more to them through democratic open up. Yes, Southeast Asia is not cannot be proud of its democratic record.
Thank you very much indeed, Jose Ramos Horta. Let's try to connect now with Maria Ressa, because I tell you what you've just been saying is a perfect segue to Maria. And can I just mention that Maria and I have very fond memories of being in East Timor for independence. It's lovely to be able to see with you here and to connect with you about how East Timor has been getting on. The situation is very different in the Philippines, clearly, Maria.
Yeah, Absolutely. It is so good to see President Ramos Horta, from the freedom fighter that he was to really upholding democratic values. I think I have like just three quick points, Rika, based on what I've heard everyone say. I think I agree that the world will never be the same again. And COVID has only exacerbated the underlying problems that were already there. We are in Manila, we are in our 17th week of what may be, a very securities driven lockdown, very military in approach. President Duterte made his announcement on March 12th, and it kicked in on the Ides of March, right? It was largely led by older retired military generals, and that was kind of the approach they took. So during our lockdown, we controlled it, but now that we're starting to ease some of it, we're going back up. Compared to Singapore, and just look at the number of people you test, each country tests per million. The Philippines has 109 million people. We've tested about 9,000 people per million of our citizens. Singapore has tested 148,000 per million, right? We're very different in scale in terms of testing, which gives you different results. And yet our results were almost at 60,000 cases. So, one of the criticisms against the government here is that they should focus a lot more on the COVID response versus the kinds of attacks that like people like me, journalists, other activists, other people demanding greater transparency, greater democratic freedoms. And the second thing I want to go to connects to that, which is really my own personal experience. It's been 4 years that the Philippine government has attacked me and Rappler, 4 years that we have pushed back. And I think, our case study is a microcosm for every democracy around the world that is touched by technology. What we have seen globally is that social media, which I now call behavioral modification systems, social media has enabled the rise of populist authoritarian style leaders where they essentially dismantle democracy from within. And this is enabled by social media because if you think about it, lies laced with anger and hate spread faster than really boring facts. We don't stand a chance against government influence operations. And the end goal of these influence operations, it's just like COVID-19, the end goal is to actually change the way people think, right? So you put in, let's call the virus lies, right? You put it into the system, it infects real people, that grows, and then you create alternative realities. That's the second one. So in my case, in 2016, we tried to hold our government to account. We fought impunity on two fronts. The Philippine government's drug war, where the Philippine police has admitted that they've killed thousands of people, 6,000 to 8,000. But human rights groups, our own Commission on Human Rights here, has said that has gone up to about 27,000 people last December. So you're talking about a lot of people killed. So impunity in the drug war. And the second is impunity of social media. In 2016, when we came out with our propaganda war series, I wrote 2 of the 3 parts of that. I was pummeled with at least 90 hate messages per hour. And here's an example of the narrative that was injected into the system, into our democratic system. The narrative is journalist equals criminal. In 2016, when people said Maria Ressa is not a journalist, she's a criminal, I laughed. But you repeat it a million times. And then you take that bottom-up social media narratives, and then in 2017, you come top-down with President Duterte himself saying that, other officials. Then you begin to hear people say, well, maybe there's something there. Then by 2018, when the government launches 11 cases and investigations against Rappler, there's more fodder for the fire. Social media continues the beating. And finally, in 2019, I'm arrested twice in a 5-week period, detained once. I have had 8 criminal charges, meaning 8 arrest warrants. In order to be free on bail, I've paid more than Imelda Marcos, who's been convicted in 4 different countries, right? And then, of course, fast forward to June 2020, when a court convicts me and a colleague, a former colleague, of a crime retroactively imposed, right? We published a story in 2012, months before the crime we allegedly committed, before the law was actually enacted. And there you are in 4 years, journalist equals criminal, and conviction 4 years later. Impact of bottom up, top down, and the kinds of alternate realities that could be put together. I think the last part is to put it in context. I'm only one reporter, one journalist, one news organization. We were born in digital. We embraced social media, right? So I drank the Kool-Aid, and we were also among the first targets. Here's what happened to us in 2020 in the Philippines. So COVID-19 is the first lockdown that has lasted, when on April 1, President Duterte himself threatened everybody, stay at home or else, and he told the police this, they should shoot them dead. And there were killings during this time period. That's difficult to take. The second is Abs-Cbn, a network both Veronica and I have worked with at different times in our careers. This is the largest broadcast company in the Philippines, multimedia, multi-platform. They were just shut down. May 5th, the network, the television stations was given a cease and desist order. They shut down a few hours later. Just last Friday, their franchise was denied by our House of Representatives. This is a network that was shut down in 1972 by President Ferdinand Marcos when he declared martial law, and it took 14 years before it opened again. This is a deep gash in what I'm calling the death by 1,000 cuts of our democracy. And then finally, the third big thing that our nation has faced is that even as all of this was going on, let me include, of course, June 15th conviction, Rappler, Ressa, Santos. The fourth is, while all that was happening, our House of Representatives quickly passes in 5 days a draconian anti-terror bill signed into law by President Duterte just recently. It's about to become a law now, to be implemented. It essentially will allow a small group of cabinet secretaries to designate someone a terrorist, someone like me, perhaps, a critic, a dissident, no longer needed to, there are no checks and balances. That anti-terror council can then order an arrest warrant, arrest without a warrant, and then hold that person for up to 24 days.
Maria,
this is a different time.
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up, I'm afraid, because we're getting it's going a bit long, and I know that you need to jump off on and do something else. But I do want to just play slightly the devil's advocate here, because people might think that people are not getting any information. The thing is that there is lots of information, but it's a competition. There's still, even if Abs-Cbn has shut down, there's GMA, there's lots of social media. GMA, excuse me, everyone, is another mainstream television company. So really, what's the real threat? What's the problem there? What's the problem?
But that's certainly one of the narratives also on social media. What's the problem is this is a time of scarcity. This is not a time of scarcity. This is a time of abundance. And the problem that every citizen around the world deals with is actually figuring out fact from fiction. When your own government carries out influence operations to manipulate the public, then you have no idea what is fact and what is fiction. The other thing to put in there is that
on the COVID-19, right?
I think the same, right? Like right now, today, for example, we had the presidential palace again say that we're doing okay, and yet 2 main hospitals just said that they're closed for business, that their capacity is full. That's alarming, right? Because that signals something. I think the last thing to keep in mind is, in order to keep operating, imagine in an atmosphere of violence and fear. These are both things that President Duterte says he wants in his leadership. I've asked him this directly. He said, it's really important to lead with fear. People must fear you. Well, when there are tens of thousands of people being killed, people will fear you. And in that environment, what kind of reporting do you have when we've gone beyond chilling effect? We're in Siberia, So this is it. You can have a ton of information. They're all saying the same thing. The world is great. President Duterte is amazing, the best leader we've ever had. One thing is true. He is certainly the most powerful leader the Philippines has ever had. I would say more powerful than Marcos. He didn't have to declare martial law to get the conditions of martial law.
Thanks very much indeed, Maria Ressa. That's incredibly valuable perspective from the Philippines. Really appreciate it. And I know you're going to have to jump off in a minute. Thank you. We're going to be moving on now to hear from Noeleen, if I may. We also have a couple of slides that I just wanted to kind of show. A bit earlier, I spoke about the Dahlia Democracy Perception Index, which includes some coronavirus-related research. This survey involved 124,000 respondents from 53 countries, and it found that the vast majority of people, 70%, are generally satisfied with their government's response to the COVID-19 virus, saying that their government's handling the crisis well. Satisfaction with the government response is practically as high in democracies as non-democracies. Overall, 70% versus 74%. So I just thought I'd just kind of put that into the mix so that people are aware of that. That's something that has been surveyed. I'm afraid I've made a bit of a mistake. Noeleen, is it okay if I go to Thant first? Because I need to ask you about the opportunities going forward. Is that okay with you? Thank you very much indeed. And I just want to let you know also, everybody, there's a Q&A panel to the right of your screen, and our guests will answer your questions at the end of the sessions, once they're moderated by the very amazing Kofi Annan Foundation team. Thank you so much, Sebastian, Lindsay, and Amanda. Thant, Myanmar's announced elections are going to take place in November. To what extent do you think the integrity of the process will be affected by public health concerns? And how? And if you would like to weigh in on anything that the others have said so far, that would be really great too.
After the US elections. So if you're unhappy with the US election results, you can tune into our elections a few days later. These will likely be free and fair elections. It will likely meet minimal conditions, at least. There might be problems of disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of people, so a certain percentage of the population. There might be people who are unable to vote because of ongoing conflict. I'm not sure that the COVID pandemic will have a big effect. It might in terms of international observers being able to come into the country. It might in terms of people being able to organize over these coming weeks. But if the virus is as it is now, where there are very few cases and almost no deaths, then I think we're on track for the second free and fair election in generations. And I think we have to remember that Myanmar over these past 10 years has made good progress in the sense of having a much freer political environment, infinitely freer than what we had under the military junta just 10 years ago. I think my fear, though, would run in a couple of different directions. And I think these are things that perhaps are related to broader issues in the region and around the world as well. The first is that so much of politics here now is the politics around identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, religious identity. And what we're having now is a situation where you have dozens of different ethnic armed organizations. We've had a lot of fighting over these same 10 years. We've had the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people over these same 10 years. And now you have ethnic minority political leaders and a younger generation of ethnic minority activists trying very hard to use this incipient democratic system to set up new political parties, to merge political parties, to contest through these polls. And because we have this constitution of a first-past-post electoral system and an electoral college, which is a winner-take-all selection of a president who then becomes all-powerful, it's very possible that ethnic minority peoples, despite whatever they try to do over these coming months, will wind up with pretty much nothing after the polls. And that will be a big blow to, I think, the potential for democratic progress in this country. But an even bigger issue here is something different, which is that, as all the speakers have touched on, I mean, we are living in an age of extreme inequality in Myanmar as everywhere in the world. And despite the fact, as I said before, that we've seen political progress of sorts over these past 10 years, the structure of the economy, the system of economic relations in this country is still fundamentally the same as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's a very exploitative and predatory economic system in many different ways for many people whose daily lives are still, very much at the edge. They're living at the poverty level or below the poverty level. Because of the COVID pandemic, their lives are even more insecure. These are people whose coping mechanisms, whose lifetime savings are gone. And they see none of their issues really reflected in the political arena, in the approach to the elections. Even more so is that with the COVID pandemic, with the economic pause in Myanmar as around the world, as with the government's commitment to spend billions of dollars in recovery, there are enormous economic issues about what the future of Myanmar's economy should be, what kind of economic system we should have, what it should mean in a time of climate change, what it should mean in a time of fast science and technology change, as I had mentioned before, what it should mean next to the rise of China and growing superpower tensions and rivalries. There are enormous economic issues to think about, and yet that is also not reflected in the political arena, which means that there is, and I think this is the basic problem, is that there's an enormous divorce between the realm of politics in Myanmar and the realm of economics. And I think unless those two arenas come together, and these big economic questions are front and center of political debates in the country, I see very little hope for the strengthening of these incipient democratic processes. And let me just end by saying that, we talk a lot about ASEAN integration, and I said before, integration for whom? And I agree very much with President Ramos Horta when he said that, we have to think about inequality both between and within ASEAN states. But I think a lot of that is easier said than done. And, if we simply free up borders, if we simply allow free movement of capital as well as people, we could also be opening the door to new intra-ASEAN exploitation and exploitative economic relationships as well. So I think we need to think about the structure of the economy, how the poorer parts of ASEAN can actually develop in a meaningful way, not just be producers and exporters of primary commodities and cheap labor. And at a time when the entire world is in reset mode, when the entire world is thinking about climate change and the future of consumerism, I think that we in ASEAN, who have so many different traditions, cultural traditions, religious traditions, experiences, colonial experience as well, why not take the lead in kind of thinking about what that economic reset could look like? Why not take the lead in thinking about what kind of economies we should have for people here? So both catching up, having a more equal society, but also about thinking about the future and the way in which people might want to live. I think in Myanmar we need to do that, but I think if we can do that in an ASEAN-wide way, all the better over these coming months and years.
All right. Can I just ask you briefly to put that also in the context of ASEAN sort of geopolitically, in the sense that, sorry, I shouldn't say ASEAN, I mean Southeast Asia. I mean, in the sense that, previously when there were global emergencies, smaller countries would look to the big powers to help and to provide leadership. And the fact is that China and the USA are embroiled in their own turmoil. And to be quite frank, my feeling is that the US is missing in action when it comes to global leadership. And it's an enormously, sad thing for me to witness as a sort of Cold War child myself. What do you think, Thant?
Yeah, I mean, I think for countries in this region, it's going to be very tough times going ahead on a number of different fronts. I think between the China and the US, wherever tensions go, I mean, we're entering in a kind of technological Cold War. You see all the issues around 5G technology and Huawei, for example. I think, countries in Southeast Asia who have a long history of trying to be friends with all great powers and trying to balance relationships are going to have a tough time doing this over the coming few years. I think in an age where globalization will be slowed down, if not put into reverse as well, I think there's a whole new set of issues that we need to think about in terms of food security, in terms of economic, national security. There are no easy answers, but I think this is exactly what needs to be debated within each country and between countries. I think that kind of deliberation is what is going to give content to democracy in the most meaningful sense of the word. And I think for Myanmar, if we can do that, that will be a big plus. But I think we need to have a network of people, institutions, think tanks, universities, thought leaders, journalists, and others, I think in Southeast Asia in particular, but I think around this broader Asian region as well, to try to take the lead. Because I see very good and fresh and creative conversations in many Western capitals, in America as well. To be frank, I see it much less in our part of the world. And yet I think that we have the potential, we have the people, we have the experiences in which we can think very creatively about what the next 50, 100 years can look like. And I think that would, again, it's important not just for itself, but I think it's important because it links in different ways to maturing democratic institutions and processes in these countries as well.
Thanks very much indeed, Thant. Please hold that thought, everybody, because I think this is a perfect way to segue into what I know that Noeleen wants to talk about. She's got so many valuable things to say, but I have been reminded by the organizers that we have poll questions to ask you. If you would be so kind as to have a look at those. We have a question about government's measures to limit the pandemic. If you're able to show that, Amanda or Lindsay, in the Kofi Annan Foundation group. The question is, have your government's measures to limit the pandemic been necessary, effective, and within democratic norms? And we sort of want to get a scale of what people think. So the options are necessary but not effective nor democratic, necessary, effective, but not democratic, and necessary, effective, and democratic. Finally, not necessary. We'll bring you the results a bit later. But for now, if I may, turn to Noeleen, because I really think that what Thant was saying just then plays into what you also mentioned before about Singapore, because you were talking about there indeed being new ideas, a fresh new energy in Singapore politics. And also, there are many Myanmar migrants in Singapore, in Malaysia, and in Thailand. And in your former role as Executive Secretary of UN ESCAP, you are all too familiar about the way that all of this works for people in this region. So I'd really appreciate hearing from you about what the pandemic's exposed about the social and economic inequalities in the region, especially when we look at the severe difficulties facing the most marginalized, and link that with democracy in the context of this region.
Thant and Ramos Horta is that democracy does not guarantee competent leadership and even effective governance. And I think that from the data from some of the surveys that we have seen, is very interesting for me. Before I start what I want to say is to see that actually people want democracy, but they feel that democracy has been captured. Almost 50% of people surveyed feel actually, I think it was 43%, feel that it has been captured by special interests and special powers. And I think that we have not, in this conversation, talked about corporate governance. I mean, we have talked about state governance, the activist state, the developmental state, the more accountable state, but we have not spoken actually about corporate governance and what we need to actually do, because that's where they generate the economies. So the economic systems and the social arrangements that have been played out that create the type of vulnerabilities and inequalities that we have seen cannot be disengaged, I think, and broken up without bringing a more holistic framework into being. And I think that what the UN has always tried to do is to say that it is time to break out of silos, to bring the economic, our social, our political, and the environmental into a more holistic framework for which we need to make decisions and to put it onto our political and policy agenda. But I would like now to look at the whole issue of democratic health and response to COVID-19 from the eyes of the most vulnerable people in the Southeast Asian region. And as we have already mentioned, the economic, the social, and the health impacts of the pandemic have been unprecedented. And it has just magnified the inequalities, the insecurity, and the humanitarian challenges within worldwide and also within our region. And the impacts are playing out along the fault lines of the inequalities of wealth, of decent work, access to social protection, the ability to influence decision-making, and the freedom from fear. And of course, the COVID-19 has forced borders to close, have disrupted supply chains, and has destroyed industries and small businesses, and has created new vulnerabilities and joblessness on a scale that we have never seen in peacetime. And who are the most vulnerable? Can we identify them? We see their faces? Can we realize the type of lives and struggles that they are having? So the most vulnerable people are our bottom 40%, almost like the ones who said your democracy has been captured by your private interests. So people who are living very close to the poverty line, and those who are already vulnerable, they're the hardest hit, and they have faced greatest peril than before, on top of the dangers of the pandemics. So what does vulnerability look like? People are becoming jobless, they're falling into extreme poverty on an unprecedented scale, and the worst affected are the daily wage workers, the informal sector workers, the low-wage workers, the majority of whom are women. And the livelihood losses have given rise to dramatic increases of food shortages, hunger, eviction, homelessness for people with no savings and no access to affordable health care and social protection. And migrants have lost employment, and remittances from the data that I've got have declined by $100 billion, leading to further misery. And these are World Bank figures. The pandemic has not stopped wars and displacement, with disastrous consequences for refugees and undocumented migrants, making it dangerous or even impossible for them to live, with mass raids and evictions happening in our region today. Human trafficking and smuggling have been on the rise as people prefer to die trying. And suicides are also on the rise. And I think that these are extremely serious concerns. And addressing the inequalities and social exclusion challenge is the very core of functioning democracy and our democratic health, if we want a democracy that delivers for all. I think that sometimes what we have seen, the way a democracy gets played out, is that it is the majority, democracy is for the majority, and the minority who happen to be the vulnerable are not attended to. So beyond democracy and democratic governance, what we need is actually the more inclusive democracy and that can deliver for all. I think the consequences of the pandemic has also made clear that human societies cannot succeed without undoing the damage caused by inequalities. And if we fail to protect the health and safety of our most vulnerable, if we put all of society at risk. So even if we want to recover better, I think our economies have to be more inclusive and have to actually make sure that it takes care of our bottom billion. Now, the thing is, what we have seen is also that the well-functioning system of governance is best suited to address a crisis of the magnitude and complexity of COVID-19, right? And these are societies that have invested in their healthcare and actually have a social contract. They have a social contract with a protection floor of fundamental rights. And in that social contract, they've been able to build greater trust and unlock the agency of everyone and have an enormous impact on the outcomes. So what are the opportunities? I think people have talked about ASEAN. ASEAN has talked about, first of all, having an ASEAN community vision of 2025, where it is people-centered and inclusive, and that they would like to promote a high quality of life for all. And I think the shift from the quantity of growth to the quality of life is extremely important. But if we are to do that, we need to address the challenge of precarious work and lives in our region by ASEAN. So basically, we need to really look at the conditions of work, at the security of employment, at health and safety concerns of our workers, and work with the private sector to improve corporate governance, improve the labor market conditions, strengthening our labor laws and rights of workers. And I think that many of our countries have these laws, but unfortunately, they're not implemented. They look good on paper. Now, we have to seriously address the issue of low-wage migrants and undocumented workers through regional agreements. We have to know that in ASEAN, regardless of whether we have regional labor cooperation agreements, millions of unskilled, semi-skilled workers have already traveled across ASEAN, often undocumented, in search of work, and many have worked illegally as trafficked or smuggled workers with no legal rights and face terrible exploitation and abuse that have actually increased tremendously during this COVID period. So what do we need is a more integrated system. I mean, ASEAN has been very good paying attention to the skilled workers. What we need is an integrated system of managed labor movement based on a common framework across our region whereby skilled and unskilled workers can move more easily and safely and respond to changes in labor market demand. And in so doing, we can actually change their trajectory of vulnerability. Now, we can also improve the opportunities of democracy at different levels. I've spoken about our regional level, but I think at the national level, we need to have quality leaders that do not exercise politics of the divide, the divisive politics, and really demonize the other. And it's very easy to demonize migrants, refugees, undocumented workers. We need to make sure that our leaders are able to put some of the issues facing our most vulnerable onto their policy agenda and to find pathways for documentation in order to even ensure public health and social cohesion. But and I think the other level that I want to stress is the community level, our local level. Many of the conflicts that we have seen in the ASEAN region are sub-national conflicts. So we need to get to the community level to build trust. And here, it is important.
Noeleen, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up very quickly. Yeah.
All right. So I think basically we need, at the local level, we need to basically build trust, but also to make sure that there's a balance between interests of the local communities as well as the migrant population.
Thank you so much, Noeleen. We could of course go on for much longer, but I'm really glad that this dialogue has taken part under the auspices of the Kofi Annan Foundation, so that at least the conversations. I want to some particularly relevant questions that have come in from our attendants are related to what you just talked about. You used the word conflict, and many people have spoken about peace in the question and answer panel. And there's been an absolute cracker from Emma Leslie, who's a friend of mine who works on conflict resolution around the region and indeed around the world. And she says that she's happy to see such an esteemed lineup of leaders. Can they formulate a team of ASEAN peace leaders or envoys and work together for resolutions of conflict across our region? And Gus, who many of you might know as well, Gus Miklat, who's here in the Philippines, but who has worked across the region on conflict as well, says that he wanted to build on that and talk about the possibility of transforming this revered panel into starting some sort of pan-regional group of eminent persons pursuing democracy and the pushback from all fronts, especially as the pandemic has exacerbated this. Can I ask President Horta to respond to that? President Ramos Horta?
Gus Miklat, he has an exaggerated view of me only because he has a huge heart. So he sees, he always inflated me and they call me eminent person only because he's such a nice
President
person.
Ramos Horta, do you deny that it's needed?
Pardon?
Do you deny that it is needed? We need leadership, as Noeleen has.
The Southeast Asia region doesn't lack outstanding diplomats, statesmen, former statesmen. But what I see throughout Southeast Asia, very slightly different from parts of Europe or particularly in Africa. I was a special envoy, special representative secretary general in Guinea-Bissau, and I dealt with across West Africa and very much with the African Union. There, people are much more open to engage outsiders to help addressing issues like South Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, Burundi, Congo, and many other conflicts in the African continent. But in Southeast Asia, each country is very sensitive to even mediation from neighbors, from other ASEAN countries. Very sensitive. I know that. I have dealt with almost all the ASEAN. So very difficult. So ASEAN itself, as an institution, has a conflict prevention agency that has been there for years. ASEAN itself, over the years, going back to the Cambodian conflict, it was allies of Indonesia, with the French, with Gareth Evans of Australia, that they are the ones who pioneered the international dialogue on Cambodia, during the killing fields and post killing field. So there has been no lack of experience among ASEAN leaders, foreign ministers, and others. So, I'm just a very small person in the midst of this immense ASEAN of luminaries, of great personalities. But I'll be happy to help to join any group that Gus Miklat, in his great heart, may think of.
Okay, Gus, in Davao, I hope you're listening. Can I ask also Thant to weigh in on that? Because Thant has been involved in peacekeeping, and then after that, Noeleen, because the issue but I'm thinking of you, Thant, because we, last time I think I saw you in Vietnam, or maybe it was Norway, and we were talking about homegrown peace in this region. And Myanmar has some of the longest running civil wars in the world at this point, doesn't it? I mean, has COVID-19 been good or bad for conflict, good or bad for democracy? Is there a link?
I don't think COVID has really affected the armed conflicts in Myanmar, just because, as I mentioned before, the virus outbreak has been limited so far. So there's a lot of fear, including amongst the ethnic armed organizations, but I think that fear has dissipated over these past several weeks. I think if we think about, sort of outside mediation, outside support, I mean, Noeleen, for example, played a really important role at a really important time in Myanmar back in 2009 and 10 and 11 in helping with that initial transition away from military dictatorship. And I think she did that in part because she had really invested a lot in trying to understand the country and understanding what kind of outside intervention might help. And the sad truth is that, over the past 10, 20, 30 years, we've also seen a lot of other good faith attempts to help in Myanmar that often haven't made similar investments. And I think all countries are unique, all countries are complex, but Myanmar is especially complex, and oftentimes we don't see the kind of investment in understanding that's commensurate with the interest in trying to help the situation in Myanmar improve. I think with conflict, yes, in a way, you're right. I mean, we've seen civil war, armed conflict in Myanmar since independence, before independence in 1948. But in a lot of the country, I mean, this is just the way it is, in the sense that there isn't a huge amount of fighting or armed fighting going on week to week. But you have areas of the country that have never been part of any bigger state control. And these are the China-Myanmar Borderlands. And how you resolve that situation in the northeast of Myanmar, Kachin State and Shan State, with China across the border, has a lot to do with bilateral relations between Myanmar and that rising superpower. You've also seen now new insurgency like the Arakan Army, which has indirect links, at least in the northeast as well. And so these are very complex situations. I would just say in closing, though, on this situation that, again, we have to link this to the economic and broader issues as well. I mean, we cannot look at conflict in Myanmar or elsewhere in isolation. We have these deep systemic problems of inequality, the way in which our economies work. If we don't integrate thinking about those things at the start of thinking about conflict, we're not going to get anywhere at any time. And we're also, as a region, in a climate emergency. I mean, Southeast Asia, more than almost any other region in the world, is going to bear the brunt of changes in climate, not in 100 years, but in 10 years, 15 years. And I think unless we also think about those kinds of issues as part of thinking about climate and regional cooperation, again, I don't think we're going to get anywhere anytime soon. So it's all of these huge issues around democracy, pandemics and new types of security challenges, climate change, and deep structural economic issues. And I think, the first step has to be maybe not an eminent sort of group of people, but really a much more networked within this region, within Southeast Asia, networked attempt to have a good conversation, urgently, really, over these coming months and years.
Thanks very much indeed for that perspective, Thant. I can attest to Noeleen's very assiduous work when you were Executive Secretary at UN ESCAP with Engage in Myanmar. I saw it, I wasn't privy to all of it, but I knew, I had some sense of what was going on. And so we really have to hand it to you that you were in that dialogue at a time when there was a lot of demonization going on about Myanmar. There is still a lot of demonization going on about Myanmar. Can we put it, though, in a larger context, the way that Thant has, but from your perspective, in the context of leadership?
First of all, I would like to build on what Thant has said. I think that we really need, if we are very serious about bringing an end to conflict, it's not just about ceasefires or the silencing of guns. I think we need to really, really look at the real root causes of conflicts. And the root causes of conflict happens to be economics, happen to be social exclusion and alienation, supposed to be the loss of dignity and dehumanization of people. It is about not having the political power or pathways, the political power or pathways to see a difference, to be able to make that difference. So people take arms, right? So I think we need to understand the coming together of the various roots and the branches of conflict. And if we are to move towards peace, then we have to understand that it has to deal basically with the variety of demands that have to be put onto the policy table. And this would include, first of all, human security, and as well as human development and the respect for human rights. I think the lack of dignity and the lack of rights makes it very difficult to bring us to a situation of sustainable peace. So I think a conversation around and a network of people who have been thinking about this and how to engage, I think a leadership of how to engage. Because what do we want? We want to make a change. and we have to be able to see who, I mean, none of our countries are homogeneous, so that there are basically clusters of people, even in some of the most difficult groups, people who are more progressive, and there are breakthroughs that can be made. But how do we capture those spaces, and how do we expand it when we have it? And how do we change mindsets? One of the discussions that I had in Myanmar with the military was a very interesting one. And this was, actually was President Thant Myint-U at that time during Cyclone Nargis, when he came back from the community and he saw the suffering of the community, but he also heard the fact that there was a lack of trust of the community to what the military was doing. And he was actually struggling. He was struggling. And we had a very interesting conversation, which was actually the difference between military security and human security. And I think
what do you mean he was struggling?
He couldn't understand why people were not more appreciative, because he felt the military had made such a lot of sacrifice, right? So he couldn't understand. All right, and then so I basically had to explain, but in a way that he could understand. So I think having these different conversations, being able to build a little bit of trust. I mean, it's not a lot, but at least enough to try to open up various spaces. So I think what we need, I personally believe, is not a top-down leadership style anymore in our region. We really need a bottom-up leadership of both men and women who can actually capture people's imagination, who can actually inspire people to rethink what society, our societies and our region can look like, who can basically create alliances to hold different power groups to account. And I would frankly say, our private sector and our corporations, the ones who are actually messing up our environment, have to be put under deeper account. And the way that they deal with people, they can't be dealing with people as commodities for their labor interests, for their capital interests. We have to look at people actually as people embedded with rights and dignity. And I think that whole three thinking, especially at this time of COVID-19, is so critical, because suddenly everyone's health is linked to each other's health. So we can't look at our own health without realizing that if we don't take care of the vulnerable, we are not going to be safe. So I think there is almost like in a way, the COVID-19 has forced us to be in a space that was so hard to find ourselves in, be it in terms of the technological age, or be it in terms of the rethinking and the reimagination that needs to take place. And we need to capture this moment.
Such wonderful, inspiring words. Thank you so much, Noeleen, for that. I couldn't agree with you more. And I look around the younger generation around Southeast Asia, and generally, I think there's a lot of hope to be had. It's just a question of making it happen, of enabling them. And I know that the Kofi Annan Foundation also is very involved in engaging the youth everywhere around the world. And of course, dear Kofi Annan, of course, this was a very important advocacy for him. I'm afraid we're going to need to bring this to a close. I'm already 3 minutes over. But before that, I just wanted to mention the results from the polls. We did ask that question. How has your government's response to the pandemic affected public trust? Well, 50% of our respondents said positively. Negative, 27%. No difference, 23% in our extremely scientific poll. I'm so looking forward to being able to find the time to continue this in the future. I really am so grateful to our distinguished panelists. His Excellency President José Ramos Horta, Dr. Noeleen Heyzer, and Dr. Thant Myint-U. Thanks also to the Kofi Annan Foundation in collaboration with the Asian Network of Free Elections and the Asian Democracy Network. And of course, most of all, to everyone who joined this webinar online. My understanding is that it will be posted for people to watch afterwards. Please do spread the word about what a valuable conversation this has been, and for people to get in on it. Stay safe, people.
Thank you, Veronica. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.